potential for Argentina should we manage to maintain the change in the fiscal position of the government can be impressive. Argentina is not growing since 2011 in per capita terms, basically because during these 14 years, we were fighting to bring down the size of the government expenditure to a level that is compatible with the taxes that Argentina collect. In my view, now with the sharp correction in the size of the government expenditure, it is very likely that Argentina will be able to grow on a permanent basis for the next few years. That is a radical change for Argentinians or for foreign investors investing in Argentina, being able to project their businesses in an economy that grows, let's say, 2.5, very, very mediocre 2.5 per year, is very different to what we had in the last 15 years, in which we had a combination of years of expansion followed by years of recession.
I'm Aoife David, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today in person in Buenos Aires by Nicolás Dujovne, an Argentine economist and former Minister of the Treasury between 2017 and 2019 on the administration of Mauricio Macri. He's had a long career in financial markets, primarily as an economist, and since 2020 has been a partner of Tenac Asset Management, which recently won Best Emerging Markets Macro Fund over 2 years as awarded by the Hedge Fund Journal. Welcome, Nicolás. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for the invitation. Real pleasure to share this time with you.
Well, I'm delighted to be speaking with you live in Buenos Aires. It's a rare opportunity, my first time here. And we were introduced by our mutual friend, Lorraine, of Lorraine Vial in Santiago. And I was keen to get an on-the-ground perspective of the state of the economy here, the state of economic reform, as well as your outlook. And your own career has been a well-documented and a fascinating one. And I think Wikipedia entry has a great chronicle of all of the positions you've held. One thing that struck out for me was your interest in photography from an early age. And I suppose I immediately think of perspective, an angle, and interpretation when I think of that. Before we launch into your main career, what do you think your interest in photography maybe has brought to your approach as an economist?
That happened when I was really young. I started taking photographs when I was in high school. And I built my own room in which I developed my photos. Many years ago, the technique was not digital, was analogic. So I spent a lot of time doing the job by myself. At that time, end of mid-80s, beginning of the 80s, there was very cultural boom in Argentina, the end of the military government, the new explosion of the culture. I came from a family in which both my parents are architects, very interested in art. I was exposed to many exhibitions when I was a child. So the combination of some interest in aesthetics and art, the fact that Argentina was undergoing a tremendous shock in terms of the change in the culture, made me very interested in something related to that. And for me, it was something which I devoted a lot of time, even when I was studying economics in Buenos Aires. But at some point, I had to choose because, there were two passions, economics and photography. And I couldn't maintain the intensity in both. So finally, I choose for economics and mathematics and finance and all this kind of stuff.
Well, the reason I ask is I always think that our outside interests, whether it's sport or art or whatever, travel, bring something to our approach to our day jobs. Yeah. And I think that perspective, that taking an angle and just interpretation can be quite interesting. So now that you chose one of your passions, at least to focus on for a career, how would you describe your kind of approach as an economist? Do you have certain core beliefs? Do you belong to a school of thought? Any way you characterize?
Well, when you are very young, you think that you have to embrace one school of thought. If a young kid in university comes to me and says, okay, I'm a Keynesian or am I, Austrian, I would say, okay, calm down. And you will find that at the end of the road, you will be ascribing to many different stuff that you will be collecting in terms of what you believe during your career, during your studies, during your personal experience. So, of course, I cannot describe me as Keynesian, neo-Keynesian, neoliberal. I have some beliefs and things that work and things that do not work. So I really believe that fiscal discipline is the most important thing in terms of the capacity of an economy to build resiliency and to generate prosperity, rule of law, institutions, openness to trade. So those are my core beliefs in terms of I like the role of institutions. I think that property rights, rule of law, transparency, integrity, clarity in the monetary policy, and intertemporal fiscal equilibrium, I will describe as my core beliefs. And that's independent of a school of thought.
And I think it's very interesting to put that into the context of the backdrop that has really been there for your career, a changing backdrop, an evolving backdrop. Can you take us through that a little bit in terms of the Argentinian economy and its backdrop throughout your career and how maybe that caused your beliefs to evolve?
I think that one of the key issues in determining my field of study was the instability of the Argentinian economy, because when I was a kid, I was very typical that Argentina was suffering a crisis. And I thought there has to be a way to fix it. So I was basically interested in politics and economics. I decided to study economics. And during most of my studies as an undergrad, Argentina was experiencing very, very high inflation. Then, in my first years as an economist, Argentina embraced stability with what we call the convertibility plan in the 90s. That was the peg of the Argentinian peso to the US dollar, with a conversion scheme similar to the one that was in Hong Kong. So in my first years as an economist, I had the opportunity of seeing how stability can be a driver of growth, as it makes very visible the inefficiencies of the economy and the areas that you need to improve. So Argentina, after stabilizing its economy, enjoyed a period of very interesting productivity growth, export growth. Agricultural exports tripled during the 90s as Argentina was able to open the economy and to become more and more productive. Then we have the breakup of the peg at the end of the 90s, early 2000s. That was a combination of some fiscal slippage coupled with external shocks. The external shock that was provoked by the Asian crisis, the Russian default, generated an appreciation of the domestic currency to levels at which we had two options. Well, to withstand a very tough deflation for 2-3 years, so as to realign the real exchange rate of Argentina, or to exit the peg. The Argentinian society decided to exit the peg. And we have very disorderly years because that was done in a very disorderly way, with breaking contracts by freezing deposits. So it was very traumatic. And then we have the first 10 years of the 2000s with a very populist government, the first 15 years that lost the opportunity of generating a lot of prosperity for Argentina, because with a positive shock in terms of trade that Argentina was enjoying, basically Argentina threw that to the garbage by subsidizing energy, transportation, and by increasing the government expenditure by almost doubling it. So it was a lost opportunity for Argentina, a very frustrating one. In the same period, many countries of Latin America enjoyed a lot of progress in terms of bringing down poverty and developing their financial sectors. In the very same period, Argentina decided to double the size of the government expenditure, to seize the pension funds, to cheat with inflation, to close the economy, to impose capital controls. So what was generated in those 15 years was very traumatic for Argentina, and we are still paying the consequences. In the last 10 years, it was very tough for Argentina to regain growth because we are still trying to correct the imbalances generated by the Kirchners during that 15 years.
And I've heard Argentina described as like a laboratory for the rest of the world. You've had a lot happen in a very condensed space of time. Some of these trends are now playing out in other countries in the world, and maybe we can learn from some of the mistakes, I suppose, made here and the experience here. I suppose if you were to look at some of those experiences that have only been experienced, say, in the US post-COVID, are there any truths that have emerged for you about, say, inflation? Do you think inflation aspects can be transitory, as was suggested by Jerome Powell famously? There's a suggestion that some of the tariff effects could be transitory. Or do you think that the Fed is right to be so data dependent as they are today, almost laser focused on that and keeping that down? Any other learnings that you think you've taken for things that always work or that never work?
Basically, in my view, inflation is a monetary phenomenon. Typically, what happened in the advanced economies with the shock of COVID generated a transitory phenomena of inflation. In my view, mishandled in many parts, especially in the US. When the COVID shock came, there was a shock to the supply. The people was not able to go to work, so supply was constrained. So I understand that on the fiscal, the government had to play a role by providing assistance for the population in terms of the calories that they need to survive the shock, but stimulating the demand by an expansionary monetary policy when supply was suffering a shock was totally wrong, in my view. In Europe, they were much more conservative in terms of the fiscal because they had less fiscal room at that time to do that. And in terms of the expansion of the balance sheet of the European Central Bank, they were also more conservative than the Fed. And I think that the Fed started too late to raise rates. But the first mistake was not that. The first one was to be too expansionary on the monetary policy with the expansion of the balance sheet. They were not printing monetary base, and that would have been a major mistake. And that's something that is basically not happening in the advanced world. Most of the governments understood that deficits should be financed by a debt and not by a monetary printing. So that's an improvement as compared with the 60s or the 70s. And that's why at the end of the day, inflation is transitory because they are not printing money. But the expansion generated by governments in the US and in Europe is financed with debt. So now you are not seeing an increase, a permanent increase in the inflation rate. I would say it's a transitory one, but what you are seeing is an increase in real rates because of the risk premia embedded in the government bonds. Typically, real rates went up when demand for investment exceeded savings, and that is not happening now, and real rates are going up. That is clearly generated by the premia embedded on the debt instruments issued by Europe, by the US. Bonds, long-term bonds were yielding minus 0.5% prior to COVID. They went down to -2 during COVID, and now they are yielding more than 1% in real terms. And in the US now, in the US Treasuries, real rates in the 10-year Treasuries are close to 2%. Close to the real rates that the US had prior to the great financial crisis when investment was much more higher than the one that we are seeing right now. So in my view, the most important consequence of what we saw in COVID in terms of a long-term effect was not inflation, that was transitory. The one generated by tariffs, in my view, is transitory. It's a one-off increase in the price of goods. Eventually, that will fade. But we have now a permanent effect generated by the fiscal profligacy, and that will decrease the rate of growth in the global economy in the next few years, in my view.
And just bringing things back to Argentina. So we've gone through the historical backdrop as to where we are today. I'd be particularly interested in maybe some things that we do not appreciate or we maybe overlook regarding the state of the economy here today. What would be some of your comments on that in terms of maybe green shoots that you see or the state of reforms?
Well, potential for Argentina, should we manage to maintain the change in the fiscal position of the government, can be impressive. Argentina is not growing since 2011 in per capita terms. Basically because during these 14 years, we were fighting to bring down the size of the government expenditure to a level that is compatible with the taxes that Argentina collect. In my view, now with the sharp correction in the size of the government expenditure, it is very likely that Argentina will be able to grow on a permanent basis for the next few years. That is a radical change for Argentinians or for foreign investors investing in Argentina. Being able to project their businesses in an economy that grows, let's say, 2.5, very, very mediocre 2.5 per year, is very different to what we had in the last 15 years, in which we had a combination of years of expansion followed by years of recession. So the number of new businesses that will be profitable with an economy that expands on a more or less permanent way will generate a 180 degrees change in Argentina in terms of employment, confidence, and we can enter into a virtuous circle in which if Argentina grows, basically we will be able to get rid of the distortive taxes that we still have, taxes on exports, taxes on financial transactions, turnover tax in the provinces. If we do that, the potential rate of growth of Argentina can be 4.5%, 5% for many years. Coupled with that, Argentina is enjoying a supply shock in terms of energy. Argentina is now increasing its production of non-conventional oil at a rate of 25% per year. Overall, oil production is growing at, let's say, 10% because conventional oil is still falling because of geological reasons. But at some point, all the oil produced in Argentina will be non-conventional. So the rate of growth will be close to 15, 20% per year. So let's say it's not difficult to see that maybe in 10, 15 years, Argentina will be producing maybe the equivalent of 2 million barrels per day. That's a radical change in terms of its external accounts and all the spillovers that will generate to our manufacturing industry that will have to adapt a lot of stuff that you need to adapt for the midstream. And then on mining, Argentina basically is exporting, 5 billion per year as compared to Chile that exports more than 10 times that figure with the same geology. So main difference is Argentina is not producing copper yet. And we have also a lot of gold and silver that is not exploited. In my view, investment in this sector will flourish if a pro-capitalist government is re-elected in 2027. Either President Milei or a non-Kirchnerist administration is elected in 2027, that will be the time in which we will see a boom in terms of investment in mining. Investment in mining is very, very capital intensive. Each project is very big, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 billion. Argentina still has the risk of the Kirchnerismo coming back. That will mean, again, closing the economy, capital controls, the prohibition of paying dividends abroad. We know that. And they will do that again because they don't have any new idea different than that one's defaulting on the debt, repudiating the IMF. So I think that after the experience of 2015, 2019 with President Macri, in which Argentina was in the right direction with a program that was functioning and we lost elections, now investors are very cautious and are waiting for the elections of 2027 so as to really deplete investments in Argentina.
How about some of the rest of the infrastructure that's in place? One of the narratives around emerging markets that we don't appreciate is that the institutions here have been tested over decades and they're actually a lot stronger. There's not as much risk around institutional, say, lack of independence or frailty, that the separation of powers works well. And do you think the rule of law, for example, are these sufficiently stable or normalized that once investors do regain trust, that those can be essentially less of a risk?
Many countries of the region built very strong institutions. So if you see what happened with Peru, in which basically you don't know who is the president because they had many changes in the last years. And Peru continues to grow. They have very strong rules, an independent central bank, and a very resilient economy with reserves of close to 40% or 45% of their GDP. Or Chile, in which a government from the left won the elections, but basically respected the independence of the central bank. They tried to modify the constitution that was not accepted by the population, by the Congress, and the administration accepted that result. They tried to pass a tax reform, and the Congress rejected that, and they had to accept that. So checks and balances are working in many, many countries of the region. Same happens in Colombia, in which Petro tried to modify most of the rules that drove Colombia to prosperity, and he couldn't do that because checks and balances were there. So I think that the region is very well positioned in terms of attractiveness for the next few years, as it is showing that you can see alternance in terms of the color of the different political parties. And, well, basically, still you have independent central banks and fiscal policy has some rules, but that's something that's a process that is built during decades. In Argentina, we are just starting. So it will take a lot of time to us to reach the same stage in terms of safeness as you see now in Chile, Peru, or Colombia.
It's interesting. So you do think it will take some time for that trust to be rebuilt?
Yes.
Because I've been curious about that. There's been a lot of discussion about, say, loss of trust, even in the US on the foreign stage, as a player, as a participant, as a trading partner, and how that is changing. And I wonder how much trust matters sometimes, because individual participants are not naive, that they know that they have to be looking after their own interests. But do you think that there are steps to rebuilding trust that could maybe accelerate that? And certainly the election result will matter. But maybe on the world stage, President Milei has been quite prominent and attracting attention.
Of course, the steps that this administration took on the fiscal are generating a lot of credibility for the administration. But you can pass legislation to try to enforce the changes that the government is delivering. But at the end of the day, legislation can be modified. So the only way of building a solid path towards generating confidence in Argentina in the long term is that the type of policies that are implemented generate results for the population. So if the population see that the result of fiscal equilibrium benefit them, at the end of the day, they will be asking for all the candidates to maintain the previous effort that was done by the previous administration. And that will generate a commitment for the candidates to maintain the policy. Of course, the administration passed legislation. I don't know if you heard about the RIGI, which is a law that protects the big projects of investment in Argentina by generating clauses that allow for arbitration abroad, by maintaining, the level of taxation constant and bringing down some taxes, and by allowing the firms investing in Argentina to take their dividends abroad, even if there are capital controls. But, what we saw in the past is that if the administration is populist enough, there's no law that can protect them against a populist. So the only way of achieving that stability is the society being vigilant that there are some rules and some, things that will not be modified, whoever wins an election.
And my last question about the region before we move on to discuss Tenac Global Fund is just you mentioned some of the surrounding economies and some of the things they've done to really put themselves on the right track and to win trust and win confidence, I suppose. I would say a lot of the region still is tainted by maybe the emerging markets label. Right now, we know that emerging markets is not that popular with external investors. It's underperformed for 15 years. And although this month flows were up, so it's getting more attention. I suppose looking at the exposure perhaps to tariffs as well, I would imagine Argentina is more focused on its own domestic issues than its exposure to US tariffs necessarily. It's maybe a peripheral issue. But are there aspects of surrounding economies that you see that are secrets to success? For example, you mentioned the PEG, Ecuador with its dollarized economy. Is that a step that you think is important to ensure more credibility?
No, in my view, the most important issue so as to generate credibility is to be solvent on an intertemporal basis. If you are solvent, that is the most important fact that will prevent that the government will advance against the property rights of the private sector. Because you've seen not only in emerging markets, governments that claim that they are very respectful of the private sector, that once they lost their fiscal solvency, are more prone to advance against the private sector. So fiscal soundness is the number one, in my view. And then your FX arrangement is secondary. I would prefer for an emerging markets a floating exchange rate regime because I think that that's the best shock absorber. So Ecuador did very well in terms of stability, but not as well in terms of growth. Of course, we don't know if that was generated by the FX policy, but it can be an explanation. But the fiscal is the most important.
So fiscal trumps everything else. That's my takeaway from that. Let's move now to Tenac Global Fund. You've been here since 2020. I'd love to hear, and you've won awards. Congratulations on the recent award. What strategy are you pursuing and what are some of the core beliefs? It is an emerging markets macro strategy.
Yes, it's a macro strategy. Well, basically, one core part of our job is, to understand that emerging markets is a big box that contains many different stuff, and our job is to dig very deep and to find the winners and avoid or short the losers. There's a wide variety of returns amongst the top performers and the underperformers. If you can capture a part of that differential, well, you can deliver very good profits with a very low volatility because you can hedge. That's, I would say, one key part of our job. Then you have to find where is value, whether in hard currency, in local currency, in quasi-sovereigns, in credit, in FX, or in local rates. So boots on the ground is very, very important. Being in EM and being also a former government official provides you with an understanding that allows you to, put on the boots of the policymaker, understand better what are his choices. And another key component of our job is to try to figure out what's going to happen in global macro, because that's the part that will determine the top-down positioning of the strategy. You can pick what you like and what you don't like inside EM, but your assessment of global macro is the one that will determine your positioning in terms of how net long you are, or if you are market neutral, or if you like duration or not. Because if the Fed is, ahead of the curve, maybe you like duration because inflation will be under control and rates will come down. If the Fed is behind the curve, you have to shrink your balance sheet and get rid of everything, even if you like a lot of stories. Having a view of global macro is the other key component of our job.
And has that been an easy thing to have, a view of global macro, given some of the sea changes we've seen, this emergence of American exceptionalism, the dogged resilience of the US economy despite it all, the lack of a recession in 23 and 24 and 25. I suppose then this massive dispersion we're seeing, even within the US market between large tech, AI, levered stocks and everything else. The US dollar stays high for so long and now weakening. How do you see, is it easy, I suppose, to be operating in global macro today? And what are some of the trends that give you conviction?
Well, first, we think that we are in the midst of deceleration of global growth. That was masked in the first half of the year because, the exporters were advancing sales so as to avoid the tariffs that were coming. Importers were advancing purchases because, the eventual tariffs that were coming. So even with the tariffs that were hiked by the US government in the first half of the year, global trade went up rapidly. And we have to pay that back because there's no demand for that. So we think that we will see a deceleration in Q3 and Q4 in global growth. Second, we think that inflation will pick up slightly in the US and is picking up slightly in the US, but that is transitory. And that eventually the Fed will have to cut. That will generate, in my view, a lot of room for some emerging market central banks to cut also. So one of the trades that we like the most to receive rates in local swaps in some countries in which still policy rates of the central banks are too high, and they will have the room because global growth will decelerate more rapidly than what the market thinks. And because as the Fed cuts, that generates the space for them to cut because the rate differential will still be high against the US. So, an example is India. In India, the policy rate of the central bank is 5.5. Inflation on a year-on-year basis is below 2%. Core inflation is slightly higher, more close to 4, but the target of the central bank is between 2 and 6. And the economy is not buoyant, and they suffer a recent hike in tariffs by the US. So, in my view, monetary policy will have to react to that. And swaps are trading as if the Central Bank of India will not cut rates anymore. So I think that there's an opportunity there. Same in Hungary, same in Brazil. Receiving rates can be one of the better ways to play EM in the next few quarters.
And given this development around rates, where does the US dollar go from here? Does it stay weak? Do you think it's giving back some of its strength?
The US is weak as compared to where it went after Trump won the elections. But on a 5-year perspective, the dollar index is, more or less where it was. And if we are going to see some weakness in the US economy, apart from COVID, we didn't see still a recession in the US since the great financial crisis. So if we flirt with a recession in the US the next few quarters, something that can happen. It's not a forecast, but it's something in which, I think that the probabilities have increased. I think that the US dollar is poised to weaken a little bit more. And that generates also opportunities in EM, because that means that EM currencies, especially the high yielders, will appreciate against the US dollar, and eventually commodities can do well as they are very linked to the dollar weakness also.
And two more questions on the global macro front. One is around geopolitics. What we've observed is that geopolitics does not seem to have much effect on markets any longer. They seem to be somewhat immune to flashpoints, conflicts, Middle East, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, or otherwise, or a terrorist attack, etc. Do you think that that is a new normal in terms of markets marching to their own tune, essentially? And then AI. I'll ask a separate question about AI and how you think about it from a macro.
On geopolitics, politics are having a lot of influence in markets. Have a look at what happened with, valuations in Argentina when Milei took office. He won the elections. The equity market did 100% return. And in my view, one of the better opportunities for the financial sector for making money the next year in Latin America related to elections. In November, we will have elections in Chile. It is very likely that the communist candidate will be defeated. Should that happen, we will see a sharp rebound on the equity market in Chile, in my view. The political party of Petro is very likely to be defeated in April next year in Colombia. That is also an opportunity, especially on the fixed income space. The spreads in Colombia were widening during all Petro's presidency because of the fiscal slippage generated by the government. I think that will be corrected by a new administration. And in Brazil, Brazil is in the midst of a vicious circle in which debt dynamics is affecting monetary policy, because the embedded risk on the local instruments is causing that the policy rate of the central bank has to be much higher than it should be with a sound fiscal position. And then a very important portion of the interest of the domestic debt adjusted by the policy rate of the central bank. So, you have a vicious circle in which, because of the fiscal deterioration that generates higher policy rates of the central bank, and that generates more interest paid by the government. So worse fiscal result and, more deterioration on the Brazilian economy. That can only be cut with, a 3-4% fiscal adjustment in terms of GDP. I don't think that Lula will do that if he's re-elected in October next year. But if a candidate from the opposition is elected, the likelihood of breaking this vicious circle is there, and that can unlock a lot of value in Brazil, in my view. So still, politics are playing a very important role in emerging markets.
That's very interesting. I agree with you. Politics are, I think it's, and even in developed markets as well, I would say maybe it's the geopolitical flashpoints, the wars, they tend to have a much more limited effect, maybe because they know that they are quickly resolved, markets adjust. Then the last question around AI, it is seen as transformational. We're in the middle of an arms race, it seems, by the large US tech companies to arm and with unlimited deep pockets to fund that. Does that factor into your thinking? Do you think AI, I think, is at the root of some American exceptionalism? I think that tech, and no question, and other countries or regions such as Europe's inability to promote innovation and be the source of that is sought behind its laggard status. How do you think about AI as a transformer?
Clearly, it's a transformer, but it's very difficult for me to, put that in numbers or to even think of what that will generate in the future, because the transformation is so impressive. We are using AI as a part of our decision process. And we are putting, machines to learn about the functioning of each central bank. And we ask them what they think about the reaction function of the central bank. Well, still humans are better in that camp than the machines, but I don't know for how many times. So transformation that we are seeing is incredible. But for me, it's impossible to make, predictions or forecasts, or because we are at a very early stage of this process.
Very interesting. Well, if even you can't make forecasts, that gives me, it is certainly enshrouded in uncertainty. I'd love to move to some short personal reflections. You've spoken a bit about maybe the lessons learned, I think, over the course of your career, but if we can maybe rephrase that question as career highs and lows, are there any you can mention here that have been real high points or low points so far?
I think that I enjoyed everything of what I did in my career. I worked in government a couple of times. I was an economist at one of the most important banks in Argentina. I did consultancy. Now I'm in finance. Every step that I did was a key component of what I am now. My way of thinking is that you have to enjoy what you are doing every day. And that process is most important than, having a final objective of where you want to get. The road is more important, like Ulysses at the Odyssey. All the difficulties, challenges are part of building, your way of thinking, who you are. So you can even have a nostalgia of, crises that you suffered in terms of your job, because those processes were part of what you are now. So you learn, of course, a lot of your success stories and of your failures.
I fully agree. I think it's the resilience that we gain from this. And I also think, having spent time in emerging markets myself in Hong Kong and Indonesia, you learn to live with and accept uncertainty, which is something that often professional participants have a very hard time doing.
That's very important. To understand that we don't know everything, and that when you are very young, you think that you know everything, of course. So as time passes, you understand that it is impossible to understand or to know everything. So you start to build a network of people to consult. You have to, use more hedges in your trades. And so partners, hedges, limits, so as to deal with the unknown. And that's very, very important.
I know President Milei famously admires economists, given he has 5 dogs, I believe, named after them. You, having grown up in the economist field, do you have anyone you particularly admire, anyone who was a mentor, or otherwise in your career, anyone that was particularly influential for you?
Many of them are economists that I knew that were practitioners. Rudy Dornbusch was, an economist that had the opportunity to know very well and to speak with him in the past. Stanley Fischer also. He was, at the Central Bank of Israel and at the IMF. Both were very relevant to understand emerging market economies. But, I can add the works of Olivier Blanchard or Kenneth Rogoff or Greg Mankiw or Stanley Fish or Larry Summers. Basically, economists that were not on the side of pure academia, but that had exposure to the real life of being in office or being at an international organization. I think that there's a lot of knowledge that you can extract from them.
And my last question gets to a little bit of the wisdom that you've shared already in terms of life. Is there any creed or motto that you live by or any advice you'd have for that young student deciding between photography and economics? And I don't know if you want to even cite any of the great literary figures down here in South America, but anything that you live by, any creed or motto?
Not many, but for a young student, I would say that don't be in a hurry. Enjoy the first years of your career. It is not that important, to run and to build. There's no one path for your career. There are many. So I will tell them to be patient and to try to enjoy and to try to, to find the appropriate path for them. And then, during your career, you will suffer a lot of setbacks and, you have to count your blessings, and to put into perspective all the good stuff that you are enjoying achieving and that every experience provides you with more background.
Thank you so much, Nicolás. This has been a great discussion, weaving, I think, the personal and the professional. You mentioned the importance of these economists that you respect and they're having on-the-ground experience, not just theoretical knowledge. I think both your own career in its many facets has shown just how important that is to not only know the books and know about the fiscal discipline and how that trumps all, but also stay agile, stay flexible and be able to adapt. So thank you so much for inviting me to your offices here in Buenos Aires and for sharing your insights.
I hope that you enjoy the rest of your stay here. And thanks.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organizations and affiliations of the host or any guest.